In Hillsborough, New Jersey, and on Manhattan's Fifth Avenue, two estates still stand as monuments to American tobacco wealth. Duke Farms, 2,700 acres, 9 artificial lakes, 45 buildings, 2 million trees. The Manhattan Mansion, 40,000 square feet of Indiana limestone modeled after an 18th century French chateau. Together, they represented Gilded Age excess at its absolute peak. But behind the marble and bronze lived something darker. Child laborers in North Carolina factories, lungs filling with tobacco dust before age 15. Construction workers who died building these monuments. Buried in unmarked graves. A black architect whose genius was deliberately hidden for his entire life. Scandals, divorces, probable murder. The tobacco baron built his kingdom on addiction that killed millions and systematic erasure of everyone who made it possible. The family that owned these estates, they sued each other. One probable homicide was covered up in 96 hours. An 80,000 square foot mansion was abandoned mid-construction and never finished. The daughter inherited $1 billion at age 12 and spent her life trusting no one. This is that story. Before we follow the Duke fortune from a devastated tobacco field to Manhattan's Millionaires Row, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if stories about Gilded Age wealth and the workers who paid for it with their lives interest you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what we uncover next. The Duke Empire began not with privilege or inherited wealth, but with catastrophe and deprivation. 1865. Washington Duke returned to his North Carolina farm after 3 years serving in the Confederate Army. He had been conscripted against his will. He opposed secession. He spent the final months of the war in a Union prison after being captured. When he finally reached home in Orange County near what would become Durham, he discovered Union troops had ravaged the property during Sherman's march. His total assets when he arrived consisted of 50 cents in currency and 2 blind mules left behind because they were useless for military purposes. The farmhouse stood but needed extensive repairs. The barns had been damaged or destroyed. Most of the crops had been stolen or burned. Tools were gone. Livestock was gone. His wife, Artelia Roney Duke, had died 7 years earlier from typhoid fever. He had 3 surviving sons to feed and no clear way forward in a region that had been economically destroyed. Then someone, accounts differ on whether it was Washington himself or one of his sons, discovered a small load of tobacco that had escaped capture. Perhaps it had been hidden in a barn. Perhaps the Union soldiers had simply missed it during their systematic appropriation of Southern resources. Either way, the tobacco sold quickly at premium prices. Demand for the crop had surged across the devastated South because so much agricultural capacity had been destroyed during 4 years of total war. What remained commanded prices that would have been unthinkable before 1861. Washington Duke recognized opportunity in scarcity. He began producing tobacco from whatever leaf he could acquire through purchase or barter. The work was grueling. Processing tobacco by hand required beating the dried leaves with wooden flails to separate stem from usable material, flavoring, packaging, transporting to market. But the profits, modest as they were by later standards, exceeded anything available from conventional farming in a region where half the working-age male population had been killed or permanently disabled. By 1872, at the height of the South's post-war impoverishment, the Duke family was selling 125,000 pounds of tobacco annually. They had moved from subsistence survival to genuine commercial success. Washington Duke had 3 sons who survived to adulthood. The youngest was James Buchanan Duke, born December 23, 1856, in what was then Orange County. His mother Artelia died when James was only 2 years old. Typhoid fever took her along with James's older half-brother. The boy grew up in the tobacco business because there was nothing else available to a family that owned no other assets. He received limited formal education, a brief stint at New Garden School, a Quaker institution that would later become Guilford College. Sometime at Eastman Business College in Poughkeepsie, New York, where he studied bookkeeping and commercial practices. But his real training came from mastering every phase of tobacco work from childhood forward, growing the crop in fields still littered with war debris, harvesting in the brutal North Carolina heat, curing the leaves in specialized barns, processing the dried tobacco, selling the finished product to buyers across a nation slowly recovering from Civil War. 1874. Washington Duke sold the farm that had been in the family for decades and moved everyone to Durham. The city sat at a strategic location near railroad lines and tobacco auction warehouses. The Dukes constructed a modest brick factory on property they purchased near the train depot and established themselves as manufacturers rather than mere producers. 4 years later, they formalized the arrangement with legal incorporation. W. Duke, Sons and Company. The three sons, Benjamin Newton, the eldest, Brody, and James Buchanan, the youngest, worked alongside their father in a business that was growing faster than any of them had anticipated. But it was the youngest son who emerged as the driving force behind expansion. James Buchanan Duke. 6 feet 2 inches tall at a time when the average American male stood 5 feet 7, powerfully built from years of physical labor, red hair that he kept severely cut, piercing blue eyes that business associates described as capable of reading a man's soul. He possessed an imposing physical presence and a mind focused entirely on expansion, consolidation, and domination. Duke arrived in Manhattan in 1884, a slim, clean-shaven 27-year-old with a Southern accent as thick as butter and ambitions that exceeded anything his father had imagined. His assignment was to establish a branch factory for W. Duke, Sons and Company, in America's largest city. He succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Within 5 years, the company would produce half the nation's cigarettes. The transformation came from a machine. 1885. Duke secured an exclusive favorable contract with the Bonsack Machine Company of Virginia after months of negotiations. James Albert Bonsack, a Virginia inventor, had created an automated cigarette rolling device that could produce 100,000 cigarettes per day when operating at full capacity. An expert hand roller making cigarettes could produce perhaps 2,000 in a 10-hour shift. The machine's output equaled 48 skilled workers laboring simultaneously. The technology was new enough that most established tobacco manufacturers dismissed it as impractical. They insisted the public preferred hand-rolled cigarettes and would reject machine-made products as inferior. They believed tradition would protect their market position. Duke gambled everything the family owned on proving them wrong. The contract gave Duke's company advantages his competitors couldn't match or replicate. Dramatically lower production costs per cigarette, exponentially increased output that allowed the company to flood markets, the ability to drop prices while maintaining profit margins that would bankrupt rivals. But the machine alone didn't build the empire that followed. Duke pioneered mass advertising at a scale the tobacco industry had never imagined possible. Cigarette cards featuring photographs of actresses and athletes tucked into every pack, creating collectible series that encouraged repeat purchases. Billboards plastered across American cities from New York to San Francisco. Newspaper advertisements that cost more than most competing companies' entire annual marketing budgets. He created brand recognition in a commodity market. He created demand where none had existed before. He made cigarette smoking fashionable among populations that had never considered the habit. By 1890, Duke's company supplied 40% of the American cigarette market. January 1890. Duke orchestrated the merger of the 5 largest cigarette manufacturers in America into a single, consolidated entity, the American Tobacco Company. He was 33 years old. He became its president immediately, despite being younger than most of the men whose companies he had absorbed. The new company didn't just dominate the cigarette market, it consumed the market entirely. Within the following decade, American Tobacco controlled 90% of domestic cigarette sales through a combination of acquisition, predatory pricing, and vertical integration. Duke acquired competitors systematically and ruthlessly. 250 companies were absorbed into the trust between 1890 and 1911. He expanded into plug tobacco in 1898, purchasing the leading manufacturers and organizing them into Continental Tobacco Company. He formed the American Snuff Company in 1900, the American Cigar Company in 1901. Vertical integration followed each horizontal consolidation. He purchased licorice firms that supplied flavoring for tobacco products, bag companies that provided packaging, box manufacturers, tinfoil producers, machinery makers. Duke achieved control over every single link in the supply chain from raw leaf purchase to final retail sale. His international ambitions matched his domestic success and operated on the same principles of aggressive consolidation. Early in the 20th century, he invaded the British market with the same predatory pricing tactics that had worked in America. The divided British manufacturers had no choice but to merge defensively. They formed Imperial Tobacco Company, specifically to survive Duke's assault. After 2 years of brutal competition that threatened to destroy profits for everyone involved, both sides agreed to a settlement that divided the world. American Tobacco would control all trade in the United States and Cuba. Imperial Tobacco would control the British Empire territories. A third venture, the British American Tobacco Company, would handle the rest of the world. Duke received approximately 2/3 of its stock. He had built a globe-spanning tobacco empire that generated millions in annual profits. The same machinery that produced Duke's fortune also produced systematic exploitation on a scale that would eventually trigger federal intervention. American Tobacco's factories employed children in deliberate violation of emerging child labor restrictions. Girls under 14 years old worked 10 to 12-hour shifts in hazardous conditions, extensively documented by the National Child Labor Committee through photographs and investigative reports. The Petersburg, Virginia facility featured images that should have scandalized the nation, but were largely ignored by a public that had grown accustomed to such practices. Young girls performing repetitive cigarette packing tasks in dust-filled rooms with no adequate ventilation. Their hands developed chronic pain and deformities from the constant repetitive motion. Their lungs filled with tobacco dust that caused respiratory diseases by their 20s. They worked because their families needed even meager wages to survive in an economy where adult male workers earned barely enough for subsistence. The company paid these children as little as possible, often less than $3 per week. Adult workers fared little better under Duke's relentless cost-cutting practices. He maintained a strict policy of hiring non-union labor at wages 10 to 20% below union rates in comparable industries. Between 1919 and 1931, worker productivity increased 120% through speed-ups and elimination of breaks. Conditions worsened proportionally as Duke and his successors squeezed every possible cent from labor costs. Workers testified later in federal proceedings about the brutality of factory life. One woman remembered decades afterward. The factories maintained rigid racial hierarchies throughout the South. Black workers were systematically confined to the worst positions, with the lowest pay and highest risk. White workers received automatic preference for anything resembling skilled labor or supervisory roles. Workers who complained about conditions, white or black, found themselves replaced within hours and blacklisted from employment at any tobacco facility in the region. By 1906, Duke personally controlled 4/5 of America's entire tobacco industry through interlocking directorates and holding companies. The monopoly generated profits beyond the comprehension of ordinary Americans. It also generated intense federal scrutiny under the new Sherman Antitrust Act. That year, a federal court found American Tobacco guilty of operating in restraint of trade. The verdict would take 5 more years to execute fully through appeals and legal maneuvering. In the meantime, Duke had a massive fortune to spend. He had estates to build that would announce his arrival among America's wealthiest men. 1893. While Duke consolidated his tobacco empire in New York through mergers and acquisitions, he began purchasing farmland in rural New Jersey with an entirely different vision. The location suited his purposes perfectly, for reasons both practical and symbolic. Hillsborough Township in Somerset County, productive agricultural land along the Raritan River, rural enough to feel isolated from the pressures of Manhattan business life, but close enough to reach by private rail car for weekend retreats, far enough away from prying eyes to create something genuinely private and vast. He bought Approximately 40 individual farmsteads over the following years, displacing families who had worked that land for generations. By the time he finished assembling his estate, he controlled 2,700 acres of prime agricultural territory. Duke's vision was straightforward, but executed on a scale that seemed almost insane. He wanted to recreate the North Carolina farm landscape of his youth, but magnified and perfected to a degree that would have been impossible in reality. He wanted the idealized version that existed in memory rather than the impoverished reality he had actually experienced. He hired the best landscape architects in America to transform working farms into European-style grandeur that had never existed anywhere in New Jersey before. James Leal Greenleaf, a member of Frederick Law Olmsted's prestigious firm that had designed Central Park, brought expertise in large estate design and formal garden planning. Horatio Buchanan, a landscape specialist who had worked on multiple Gilded Age estates, provided additional planning and execution. Ellen Biddle Shipman, one of the few prominent female landscape architects of the era, contributed her knowledge of plant selection and garden composition. Together, they created something that had never existed in New Jersey before and would never be replicated after. Duke ordered the excavation of 9 artificial lakes across the property. The work required hundreds of laborers moving earth by hand and horse over multiple construction seasons. The scale was extraordinary. The largest lake covered dozens of acres. The smallest was larger than most farm ponds. The lakes served dual purposes in Duke's vision. They enhanced the aesthetic beauty of the property by creating water features for reflection and recreational use. They also powered the estate through a sophisticated water management system that included hydraulic rams for moving water uphill and primitive hydroelectric generation for some buildings. Conservatories rose on the property using the latest glass technology. The Lord and Burnham firm, specialists in greenhouse construction, built a major glass structure around 1900 that covered over an acre under glass. The Orchid Range followed in 1903, becoming the birthplace of most commercially available orchid varieties in America. Duke became obsessed with orchid cultivation and spent enormous sums importing rare species from around the world. 45 buildings eventually dotted the landscape in a carefully orchestrated pattern. Barns designed to look like French rural architecture, maintenance structures disguised as picturesque cottages, staff quarters that housed dozens of workers, storage facilities, guest cottages for visitors. 18 miles of roadways connected every corner of the property, engineered to precise grades for carriage traffic. Over 2 miles of stone walls defined boundaries and created formal garden spaces, built by Italian stonemasons who were brought to New Jersey specifically for this project. Approximately 35 fountains appeared throughout the property, many of them elaborate bronze sculptures imported from European foundries. Duke purchased bronze eagle sculptures from Paris cast around 1902 by French artisans to guard the main entrance gates. The eagles weighed several hundred pounds each and cost more than most American workers earned in 5 years. He planted over 2 million trees across the property: oaks, maples, specimen conifers, flowering varieties, in a deliberate attempt to create instant mature landscapes that would normally take centuries to develop. The scale of construction was extraordinary even by Gilded Age standards. The labor required to build it went almost entirely unrecorded in any surviving documents. Hundreds of workers over 3 decades of continuous construction. Men who excavated those 9 lakes by hand and horse, moving millions of cubic yards of earth. Craftsmen who built 2 miles of stone walls from locally quarried rock. Gardeners who planted and maintained formal gardens that required daily attention. Their names don't appear in any ledger or construction record. Their injuries and deaths were never documented systematically. They were paid as little as Duke's estate managers could negotiate and replaced immediately when they could no longer perform physically demanding labor. Some undoubtedly died during construction, falls from heights while building structures, crushing injuries from moving massive stones, drowning during lake excavation. None of it was recorded. 1899. Duke opened the property as a semi-public park, allowing local residents access to the grounds on specific days. For 16 years, visitors could enjoy the manicured lawns and formal gardens that Duke had created. Families came for picnics on Sunday afternoons. They ice skated on the frozen lakes in winter. They toured the greenhouse displays of exotic orchids and tropical plants. They gathered wildflowers from meadows. They took long carriage drives through European-style alleys of trees that wouldn't have looked out of place in France or England. The public loved it. They had no idea the beauty they admired was funded by child labor in North Carolina factories. They never asked how lakes had been excavated or who had built the stone walls they photographed. The estate functioned exactly as Duke intended, a monument to his success that completely hid the human cost of building it. Duke himself divided his time between New Jersey and Manhattan in those years, spending weekends at Duke Farms and weekdays managing his tobacco empire. The estate served as a retreat from business pressures and a place where he could exercise complete control over his environment. But by the early 1900s, he was approaching 50 years old. He was unmarried. He needed a wife for social legitimacy, and he needed a Manhattan address worthy of a man who controlled the tobacco industry. September 1904, Duke married Lillian Fletcher McCready in a quiet ceremony in Camden, New Jersey, that generated surprisingly little press coverage given his wealth and prominence. Lillian was a divorcee from New York. Her previous husband, William F. McCready, had been a broker with moderate success. The marriage appeared to offer Duke what he wanted: companionship after years of bachelorhood, social legitimacy in New York society that still viewed him as a North Carolina upstart, an escape from rumors about his personal life that had circulated in Manhattan social circles. The marriage lasted exactly 2 years before collapsing in spectacular public fashion. Duke filed for divorce in 1906 with allegations that scandalized American breakfast tables for months. The proceedings were covered extensively by newspapers across the country. His specific accusations were humiliating and calculated to destroy Lillian's reputation. He claimed she had carried on an extramarital affair with an Army major throughout their courtship and marriage. Duke testified under oath that the major had won Lillian's heart long before Duke had proposed, and that she had only married him for his money. Intercepted cablegrams allegedly proved ongoing contact between Lillian and the major, even while Duke and Lillian were supposedly on their wedding trip. Duke's lawyers produced witnesses who claimed to have seen Lillian with the major in compromising situations. The New York courts pointed an accusing finger toward Lillian Duke. They implicated the handsome officer. They granted Duke his divorce with prejudice. The case was described years later by Duke's authorized biographer Robert Durden as the absolute low point in his personal life. Not because Duke suffered any consequences, because the public spectacle revealed something ugly about how wealth operated in American courts. Duke had lawyers who cost more per hour than most workers earned in a month. He had money to hire private investigators who could manufacture evidence if necessary. He had judges and politicians on his payroll. Lillian had nothing. No family money, no powerful connections, no legal resources beyond what charity could provide. The divorce left her financially destitute. Duke's settlement offer was insultingly small. For the next 20 years, Lillian would fight through the courts to have the divorce declared invalid on grounds of perjured testimony. She would fail every single time. By the 1920s, she lived in a single furnished room at 125 West 88th Street in Manhattan. Her only companion was a small dog named Pom Pom, weighing 1.5 pounds. Her former possessions, furniture, jewelry, clothing from her brief period as Mrs. Duke sat in a Hoboken warehouse that she couldn't afford to access. She tried to survive by selling furniture sample books door to door. The woman who had briefly been Mrs. James Buchanan Duke ended in poverty, while her ex-husband accumulated more millions and built more monuments. Duke moved on quickly from the scandal as wealthy men could in that era. In November 1906, less than 3 months after his divorce was finalized, he attended a party at his brother Benjamin's house in Manhattan. There he met Nanaline Holt Inman, a widow from Atlanta. She was from a prominent Southern family. Her first husband, William Patterson Inman, had been a wealthy cotton merchant who died young. She had a son from that marriage, Walker Patterson Inman, born in 1894. She was described by those who knew her as a self-possessed beauty, a Southern steel magnolia, a woman who understood how to manage wealth and social position. Duke courted her for 8 months with a determination that surprised those who knew him. They married in July 1907 in a ceremony that was considerably more public than his first wedding. The second Mrs. Duke made it clear from the beginning that she wanted a Fifth Avenue mansion to match her new social position. Duke began planning immediately. January 1909. Duke purchased the existing Henry H. Cook Mansion at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 78th Street for $1,250,000, the equivalent of approximately $35 million in current currency. The Cook House had been built in the 1880s by a successful businessman. It was barely 25 years old. It had been considered one of the Avenue's most prominent residences when it was new. None of that mattered to Duke. The New York Times later noted the irony with barely concealed criticism. Quote 2, the demolition contractor who handled the project called it the best-built house ever torn down in New York City. Individual mahogany panels worth $55 were sold at auction for $3. A $15,000 marble fireplace went for $300. By August 1909, the house was completely gone. Nothing remained but an empty lot waiting for Duke's vision. Duke hired Horace Trumbauer of Philadelphia to design the replacement mansion. Trumbauer had built an enviable reputation creating palatial residences for America's wealthiest industrialists. He had completed Linwood Hall for streetcar baron Peter A.B. Widener, just outside Philadelphia. 110 rooms, 55,000 square feet, the largest private residence ever built in the Philadelphia area. He had designed the Elms in Newport, Rhode Island, for coal baron Edward Julius Berwind. He had created Whitemarsh Hall for banker Edward T. Stotesbury. Trumbauer understood instinctively what wealthy clients wanted. European grandeur adapted to American scale and modern conveniences. Architectural statements that announced arrival among the nation's elite. Classical proportions that suggested old money even when the fortune was barely a generation old. But Trumbauer himself had no formal architectural education. He had started as a draftsman and worked his way up through talent and business acumen. He delegated the actual design work to trained architects in his employ. In 1909, that meant delegating almost everything to Julian Francis Abele. Abele had become the firm's chief designer that same year, though the promotion came without any public recognition. The timing was not coincidental. Duke's mansion would be Abele's first major commission in his new role. Julian Francis Abele was born April 30th, 1881 in Philadelphia. He was the first African-American to graduate from the University of Pennsylvania's Architecture Department in 1902 with both undergraduate and graduate degrees. His talent was obvious from his student work. The dean of the architecture program, Warren Laird, personally brought Abele to Trumbauer's attention with a strong recommendation. Trumbauer hired him in 1906 as a junior designer. He immediately recognized Abele's abilities exceeded his own. In 1907, Trumbauer sent Abele to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, one of the most prestigious architecture schools in the world. The school that had trained the architects who rebuilt Paris in the 19th century. Abele spent 2 years there studying classical design principles. He returned to Philadelphia in 1909 with training in classical architecture that Trumbauer himself completely lacked. Within months, he had been quietly promoted to chief designer. His first major commission was the Duke House on Fifth Avenue. The building Abele designed would be modeled after the Château La Botière in Bordeaux, France, designed by French architect Étienne Laclotte in 1773 for a wealthy wine merchant family. Trumbauer's firm filed official plans with New York City in September 1909, 3 stories plus attic, French classical style. Estimated construction cost of $365,000. The actual final cost would far exceed that initial estimate. Construction proceeded steadily through 1910 and 1911 under Abele's supervision. Indiana limestone formed the facade, creating a marble-like appearance that would age beautifully over decades. The house measured 72 feet wide by 140 feet deep, 40,000 square feet total across all floors. From Fifth Avenue, the design appeared to be only 2 stories. The 3rd story and attic were cleverly hidden behind a prominent stone balustrade that ran the length of the building. A 2-story portico dominated the entrance, featuring paired Doric columns on the first level and Ionic columns on the second. Generous coins accented the building's corners. Long windows with stone surrounds and high ceilings filled every floor with natural light. The interior followed French classical principles throughout. 4 large corner rooms surrounded the main entrance hall on the first floor. A grand staircase ascended from the center hall to the upper levels. Every proportion was mathematically perfect. Every molding was precisely placed according to classical orders. Every shadow fell exactly as Abele intended. The design was entirely his. The credit went entirely to Trumbauer. June 19, 12. The Duke family moved into the completed mansion. James Buchanan Duke, his wife, Nanaline. 14 servants who lived in cramped quarters in the attic and basement. Nanaline was 7 months pregnant with their first and only child together. Their daughter Doris would be born 5 months later in November. The New York Times designated the building as the costliest home on Fifth Avenue, though the actual figure remained private. Trumbauer's firm received lavish recognition in architectural publications. Abele's name appeared nowhere in the press coverage or professional journals. Not in the New York Times, not in Architectural Record, not in any publication. This erasure was deliberate and systematic. Custom and architectural firms dictated that drawings be signed with the firm's name rather than individual designers' names. But Abele's race made any recognition impossible, even if custom had allowed exceptions. He was black in Jim Crow America, a nation that had recently witnessed the worst period of racial violence in its history. He could design palaces for tobacco kings. He could create some of the nation's most important buildings. He could master classical architecture better than almost any white architect. He could not claim credit. He could not have his name on buildings. He could not be acknowledged publicly for work that was obviously his. Abele once said of another project, quote 3, "The statement captured his situation perfectly. He worked in shadows deliberately. He created beauty that others claimed as their own." Over the next 4 decades, he would design some of America's most important buildings: the Widener Memorial Library at Harvard University in 1915, which still serves as Harvard's main library; the Philadelphia Museum of Art between 1916 and 1928, one of the largest art museums in the country; Duke University's entire West Campus Gothic buildings through the 1920s and 30s, the chapel, the library, the football stadium, the gymnasium, Cameron Indoor Stadium, the Allen Building. He worked on Duke's campus design for over 20 years from his desk in Philadelphia. He likely never visited the campus. Duke University remained strictly segregated until 1961, 6 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Abele, who had designed every major building on campus, could not have eaten in the dining halls or used the facilities or attended events in the buildings he created. The American Institute of Architects did not admit Julian Abele as a member until 1942. He was 61 years old. He had been designing America's most important buildings for nearly 40 years. He died October 31st, 1950. Heart attack, age 68, still working, still under-recognized. The Duke family lived in the Manhattan mansion Abele designed for 13 years. They never publicly acknowledged who actually created their home. Nanaline lived there for another 33 years after her husband died. She never mentioned Abele's name. 1911. The United States Supreme Court issued its landmark ruling in United States versus American Tobacco Company, ending Duke's monopoly through judicial force. The decision ordered the tobacco trust broken into multiple separate competing entities: American Tobacco Company, Liggett and Myers, R.J. Reynolds, P. Lorillard Company. Each would operate independently. Duke retained personal control only of the British American Tobacco Company for global operations outside the United States and Britain. The empire he had spent 21 years building through relentless acquisition and consolidation was fractured by judicial decree. His personal fortune remained intact. The Supreme Court couldn't seize that, but his power to dominate the industry was legally ended. Duke responded to the antitrust defeat by pivoting aggressively to a completely different industry. His brother Benjamin had opened the family's first textile mill in Durham in 1892. The textile business required enormous amounts of electrical power. Around 1900, Duke organized the American Development Company specifically to acquire land and water rights on the Catawba River system in the Carolinas. He established the Catawba Power Company in 1904. The following year, he founded the Southern Power Company with the explicit goal of providing electricity to textile mills throughout the Piedmont region. It would eventually become Duke Power, the direct precursor to today's Duke Energy conglomerate that serves millions of customers. The power business proved as lucrative as tobacco had ever been. Within 20 years, Duke's electrical facilities supplied over 300 cotton mills and various other factories across the Piedmont region of North and South Carolina. He was methodically building a second fortune in hydroelectric power that would eventually rival his tobacco wealth. The work conditions in Duke's power plants mirrored those in his tobacco factories. Coal stokers worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit near the boilers. Many died from heat exhaustion before reaching 40 years old. Others developed chronic lung diseases from coal dust. No safety equipment protected them from burns or mechanical injuries. No medical care was provided. No records documented their deaths or disabilities. They were simply replaced when they could no longer work. Their families received no compensation. That same year of 1911, Duke began his most ambitious construction project at Duke Farms, an 80,000-square-foot mansion that would dwarf anything else on the property. The structure would sit on a prominent hilltop overlooking what Duke envisioned as the Great Lawn. It would have over 100 rooms. It would feature the latest mechanical systems for heating, ventilation, and lighting. Foundation work started immediately. Massive excavations created basement levels that extended deep into the hillside. Terraces were carefully landscaped down the hillside from the foundation site. Redbud trees were planted along the descending stairs, hundreds of them. The mansion was intended to be Duke's masterpiece, the culmination of everything he had learned about construction and design. The permanent residence where he would live out his final years surrounded by the landscape he had created. Then everything stopped permanently. The 1911 antitrust decision had diverted Duke's attention to reorganizing his North Carolina business interests. The outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914 created additional pressures on American business. By 1918, with America fully engaged in the war effort, construction had been abandoned entirely. Duke made the decision to donate the remaining building materials to the government for war use. Only the foundation remained standing. 80,000 square feet of basement infrastructure and retaining walls sitting empty on a prominent hilltop. The terraces led down to an incomplete vision. The redbud trees bloomed each spring over a monument to interrupted ambition and changed priorities. The unfinished mansion stood and still stands today as an accidental but perfect metaphor. Gilded Age excess halted by progressive-era reforms. Private kingdoms undermined by antitrust enforcement and world events. Limitless ambition finally meeting actual limits that money couldn't overcome. Duke never resumed construction after the war ended. The foundation remains today as it was left in 1918. It's now called the Old Foundation and is the most photographed spot at Duke Farms. Visitors love the ruins. They find them romantic and mysterious. They don't know the mansion was abandoned specifically when Duke's monopoly was broken by the Supreme Court. They don't know it represents the moment when even tobacco kings discovered they couldn't have everything they wanted. Doris Duke spent her early childhood at Duke Farms, surrounded by wealth beyond anything ordinary Americans could comprehend. When she was born on November 22, 1912, at the Duke Mansion on Fifth Avenue, newspapers across the country immediately christened her the richest little girl in the world, the $1 million baby, the golden child. Duke would send servants from the estate out into Hillsborough Township neighborhoods to literally round up local girls to play with his daughter on weekends. Doris needed companions. The estate was isolated from normal social life. The family lived behind gates and walls. Doris grew up knowing from her earliest consciousness that she was different from Autas. Everyone treated her differently. Every interaction was shaped by awareness of her father's wealth. Everything in her life revolved around money she didn't yet control. October 10, 1925, James Buchanan. Duke died in New York City. He was 68 years old, complications from pneumonia. His will triggered one of the most complex series of property transfers in American history. In December 1924, nearly a year before his death, he had established the Duke Endowment with an initial gift of $40 million. At his death, he added another $67 million to the trust. The endowment was structured to support specific institutions in perpetuity. Duke University, which would be renamed from Trinity College in his honor. Davidson College. Furman University. Johnson C. Smith University, a historically black institution. Nonprofit hospitals and children's homes throughout the Carolinas. Rural Methodist churches in North Carolina. Half of his approximately $100 million estate went directly to the endowment. The other half went to his 12-year-old daughter in a complex trust arrangement. Doris Duke inherited somewhere between $80 and $100 million at age 12, the equivalent of $1.79 billion in current currency. She would receive control of the money in installments when she reached ages 21, 25, and 30. But before he died, Duke summoned his daughter to his bedside and gave her one final piece of advice. His deathbed words to the 12-year-old were brutally simple and would haunt her for the rest of her life. Trust no one. The instructions shaped everything that followed. Duke's widow, Nanaline, received only a modest trust fund that provided comfortable income, but nothing approaching the scale of Doris's inheritance. The deliberate disparity created immediate tension between mother and daughter. They were supposed to manage the vast estate together until Doris reached majority age, but the will's ambiguity about property management allowed for potential auctions and sales of real estate. Doris, at age 14 in 1927, took the extraordinary step of filing a lawsuit against her mother and the other executors of her father's will. She wanted to prevent any sales of family properties. She wanted to preserve Duke Farms and the Fifth Avenue mansion intact. The case went to court. A 14-year-old girl sued her own mother and her father's closest business associates. She won decisively. The judge ruled in her favor. At 14, she had successfully taken legal action against her own mother and secured direct control of the family's real estate holdings. The relationship between Doris and Nanaline never recovered from that legal battle. When Doris expressed interest in attending college like other young women her age, her mother absolutely forbade it. Instead, Nanaline took her daughter on an extended grand tour of Europe that lasted over a year. They stayed in the finest hotels. They attended exclusive social events. Doris was formally presented as a debutante in London in the presence of British royalty. In 1930, at age 18, she had her official American Society debut at an elaborate ball held at Rough Point, the family's massive summer mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. She was 6 feet tall at a time when the average woman stood 5 feet 4. The press was fascinated by her height, her wealth, and her apparent unhappiness. She and Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, were nicknamed the Gold Dust Twins by newspapers. The Great Depression was destroying millions of American families financially. The public developed a morbid fascination with photographs of wealthy young women in evening gowns. Doris hated every moment of the attention. She actively avoided cameras whenever possible. She refused interviews. For over 50 years, she would hide from publicity whenever possible and sued journalists who wrote about her. Doris Duke's first marriage ended badly. So did her second marriage, and everything that came after followed the same pattern of wealth distorting relationships. In 1935, at age 23, she married James Cromwell. He was 39 years old, 16 years her senior, a divorced bon vivant from a wealthy Philadelphia family, an aspiring politician who had served as ambassador to Canada. Doris married him primarily to escape her mother's controlling oversight. The wedding took place at Duke Farms with minimal press coverage. Doris had the word, quote, 5 deliberately removed from the traditional marriage vows. The couple took an 11-month honeymoon around the world on a private yacht. Multiple observers later noted that Cromwell spent most of his time on the upper deck socializing, rather than in the stateroom with his bride. Quote 6. Duke said years later in Rare. Testimony, quote 7. She bought art, she bought jewelry, she bought furniture and artifacts. Shopping became a substitute for intimacy. According to several biographers who had access to Duke's private papers, she began having affairs during that honeymoon. Duke Kahanamoku and Sam Kahanamoku, legendary Hawaiian surfer brothers, were both mentioned in documents. Other names appeared in correspondence. The marriage lasted 8 years in name only. They divorced in 1943. The settlement negotiations were vicious. At age 27, Doris Duke became pregnant. The indiscreet affairs during her marriage meant many possible fathers existed. July 1940. Her daughter Arden was born 2 months premature in Honolulu. The baby died within 24 hours. Multiple organ failure. Doctors told Duke she could never successfully carry a child to term again. The devastated mother consulted psychics and mediums to try to contact her dead daughter. She held seances. She became obsessed with spiritualism and the possibility of life after death. She would attempt adoption decades later. It would not end well. After divorcing Cromwell during World War II, Duke traveled to Egypt ostensibly to aid the war effort. She organized poker games at Cairo's Egyptian club specifically for Allied troops. She applied to the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. They hired her as an intelligence operative and sent her to Italy. When the OSS withheld the interesting assignments she wanted, she defected to Hearst's International News Service. She worked as a foreign correspondent writing dispatches from Rome about the Italian campaign. She moved to Paris after the war to work for Harper's Bazaar magazine. There she met Porfirio Rubirosa in 1947. Rubirosa was a notorious Dominican playboy with a legendary reputation for sexual prowess that extended throughout European and American high society. He was currently married to French movie star Danielle Darrieux. According to one of Duke's biographers who had access to financial records, Duke paid Darrieux $1 million to divorce Rubirosa quickly. Duke married him in September 1947. The marriage lasted exactly 13 months. They divorced in October 1948. Rubirosa moved on almost immediately. He later married Duke's longtime rival, Barbara Hutton. Duke found out from a newspaper headline while eating breakfast. She reportedly got drunk and screamed for hours about Hutton. Quote 9. Duke never legally remarried after Rubirosa. She had other relationships over the following decades. Some ended in public scandal. Jazz musician Joseph Armand Castro claimed they had married in a private closed ceremony. He sued her publicly for recognition. He also sued her for stabbing him in the arm with a butcher knife during an argument. Duke countersued to force him to cease and desist. Rumors connected her romantically to General George S. Patton during the war. Actor Errol Flynn, her surf instructor Duke Kahanamoku. Affairs accumulated over decades. Trust never developed with anyone. Her father's deathbed advice, trust no one, had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. October 7th, 1966. Doris Duke was preparing to leave her Rough Point mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, after a weekend visit. Eduardo Tirella, her interior designer and close friend, was with her. Tirella had worked for Duke for several years, redesigning interiors at multiple Duke properties. He was openly gay. Their relationship was close but not romantic. Around 4 in the afternoon, they got into Duke's 2-ton station wagon. Tirella got out of the car to manually open the heavy wrought iron gates at the estate entrance. Duke's official account of what happened next was straightforward and never changed in subsequent questioning. She claimed she slid over from the passenger seat to the driver's seat. The car lurched forward unexpectedly. It struck Tirella against the gates. The vehicle then crashed into a tree, damaging the front end. A 13-year-old paperboy on his afternoon delivery route heard something completely different. He heard 2 people arguing loudly inside the estate grounds. The roar of a car motor being gunned, a sickening crash of metal against metal and body, a man screaming in agony, then a brief pause, then a second distinct impact. The sound of the engine being gunned again, more screaming. The boy approached the gates cautiously. Duke emerged from the damaged car and screamed at him to go away immediately. He left quickly. The boy's father later took him aside and warned him carefully that Doris Duke was a very dangerous person who had done terrible things before. She had powerful people on her payroll who were very unscrupulous. The boy should not speak to police without the father present. The boy never went to the police with his testimony. Newport Police Chief John Radice arrived at the scene quickly. As soon as the medical examiner arrived at the hospital to interview Duke about the incident, she hired him as her personal physician. He immediately placed her in a secure private room in the hospital. State police investigators who wanted to question her were blocked from access. The man legally charged with determining the official cause of death had gone directly onto Doris Duke's payroll. Doctor-patient privilege now protected anything she told him about the incident. Chief Radice closed the criminal case in 96 hours. Accident, tragic but accidental death. The medical examiner's report supported that conclusion. Tirella's injuries didn't actually match Duke's version of events. He had relatively few injuries to his lower legs and feet. If he had been pinned against the gates by a car bumper, as Duke claimed, his legs would have been severely crushed. The bottom of the iron gates showed damage consistent with multiple repeated impacts, rather than a single collision. Duke made significant charitable donations to the town of Newport immediately after the incident. The timing was noted by several newspapers, but not investigated. Tirella's family sued for wrongful death in civil court. They won $75,000 in damages. The amount was substantially reduced from the initial jury award through the intervention of Duke's expensive lawyers. 5 years after Tirella's death, a Rhode Island civil trial found Duke legally negligent in his death. But the wrongful death suit brought by Tirella's family was their only legal recourse. The criminal case had been permanently closed as an accident. No charges were ever filed. In 2020, veteran journalist Peter Lance reinvestigated the case systematically after discovering gaps in the official record. He published his findings in a detailed Vanity Fair article and later in a book. Documents that should have been in police archives were mysteriously missing. Lance was able to locate some of them through other sources, witness statements that contradicted Duke's account, photographs that showed damage inconsistent with the official story. His conclusion was unequivocal. She committed 6 separate intentional acts that resulted in his death. The Newport Police Department formally reopened the case in August 2021 after Lance's book was published and generated renewed public interest. They re-examined the evidence for 5 months. They closed the case again in January 2022. The official ruling remained accidental death. Eduardo Tirella was killed on the night before the rest of his life was supposed to begin. Duke lived another 27 years, 1985. Duke met Chandi Hefner at a gathering in Hawaii. Duke was 73 years old. Hefner was 32. Duke felt an immediate maternal connection to the younger woman. She had never successfully had children after losing her daughter Arden in 1940. She had mourned that loss for 45 years. In 1988, at age 75, Duke formally adopted Hefner in a legal proceeding. For 2 years, they maintained what Duke considered a genuine familial relationship. Duke showered Hefner with gifts, expensive cars, jewelry, property, millions of dollars in trust funds. Then Hefner began dating one of Duke's bodyguards. Duke's longtime personal secretary later explained the problem with brutal honesty. Quote 12. Duke expected complete loyalty in return for financial support. Hefner's attention became divided. Duke couldn't tolerate that. In 1990, she disinherited Hefner completely and attempted to dissolve the adoption. Duke's final 3 years were marked by increasing isolation and dependence on her staff. Her butler, Bernard Lafferty, an Irish immigrant with a serious drinking problem, became her sole confidant and gatekeeper. He controlled access to Duke completely. He made decisions about her medical care. He managed her schedule. He supervised her finances. October 28, 1993. Doris Duke died at her Beverly Hills home at age 80. She left her $1.2 billion fortune primarily to charity through the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Control of the foundation went to Lafferty and a board of trustees. Questions about Duke's mental capacity in her final years emerged immediately. Multiple parties challenged the will, but after extensive litigation, the will stood largely intact. Before Doris Duke died, she created something genuinely beautiful at Duke Farms despite the darkness in her personal life. Beginning in 1958, when she moved back to the New Jersey property full-time after her mother's death, she focused increasingly on horticulture and garden design. Through the late 1950s and the 1960s, she created the Duke Gardens on a scale that rivaled anything from the Gilded Age. 10 acres of interconnected glass conservatories, 11 themed indoor display gardens, each one a full-scale recreation of a different country, historical period, or horticultural theme, Italian Renaissance gardens, French formal gardens, English landscapes, Chinese gardens, Japanese gardens, desert environments, tropical jungles. Each was meticulously researched and executed. Doris designed all but one of the gardens herself without any formal botanical training, but she had a clear vision and unlimited resources. She was personally involved in every aspect of construction, repair, and remodeling over 35 years. She maintained and modified the gardens throughout her life. In the 1970s, she added extensive night lighting systems. She introduced public night tours that became enormously popular. The Duke Gardens became one of New Jersey's major tourist attractions. Over 200,000 people visited annually. Duke died in 1993. Her will left Duke Farm specifically to the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation with explicit instructions. The property should be used primarily for wildlife conservation, environmental education, and scientific research, not as a public garden. The foundation faced an immediate and painful dilemma. Duke Gardens required massive amounts of energy to maintain year-round. The glass conservatories consumed electricity constantly for heating, cooling, and lighting. The gardens featured exclusively non-native exotic plants from around the world. This directly contradicted a conservation mission focused on restoring native ecosystems. Operating costs exceeded several $million annually. The environmental mission that Doris had specified in her will demanded something radically different from what she had actually built. March 2008. The Foundation's Board of Trustees announced publicly that Duke Gardens would close permanently within months and would then be demolished completely. Public outcry followed immediately and intensified over subsequent weeks. In April 2008, opposition emerged through open letters published in local newspapers. A Save Duke Gardens campaign started spontaneously on Flickr and spread to other social media. Hundreds of letters reached the Foundation's trustees over the following months. Joan A. Sparrow, Nannerl O'Keohane, and John J. Mack received extensive media coverage about the controversy. Petitions circulated, protests were organized. The trustees held firm despite intense pressure. They argued publicly that true environmental stewardship meant native plants and restored habitats, not exotic collections in energy-intensive greenhouses. Creating truly sustainable, ecologically friendly displays required removing what Doris had built over 35 years. May 2008. The Duke Gardens closed permanently to public tours after operating for 50 years. Demolition proceeded methodically despite ongoing protests. Between 2008 and 2012, the Foundation reorganized virtually the entire 2,700-acre property according to conservation principles. Workers removed invasive species systematically. Norwegian maple trees that Duke had planted decades earlier, Asian ailanthus trees, phragmites reeds that choked waterways, all were eliminated and replaced with native species. They restored native habitats across hundreds of acres. The Great Meadow, which had been maintained as a perfectly manicured lawn since the 1930s, was converted to native grassland that now supports threatened grassland bird species. The farm barn, which had been a thoroughbred horse barn, was renovated to LEED Platinum certification standards. 22,000 square feet of visitor center space, educational exhibits, and a public cafe. The Orchid Range, the original conservatory from around 1900 that had survived 100 years, was carefully renovated to LEED Gold certification rather than demolished. New trails appeared throughout the property, 18 miles total, 12 miles accessible to bicycles, 4 miles fully paved for wheelchair access. May 19th, 2012. Duke Farms officially reopened to the public as a completely reimagined environmental center. The Duke Gardens that Doris had created and maintained were gone forever. Visitors who had loved them for decades, who had proposed to spouses there, who had brought children there, who had visited annually for years, lost something genuinely irreplaceable. The Foundation argued it was absolutely necessary for genuine conservation, that true environmental stewardship meant native ecosystems, not exotic plant collections in heated greenhouses. The logic was environmentally sound. The loss was emotionally real. Both statements could be simultaneously true. The estate that had begun as James Buchanan Duke's attempt to recreate an idealized North Carolina farm landscape had finally become an actual working conservation laboratory. Tobacco money accumulated through addiction and exploitation was now being used to restore ecosystems that had been destroyed by a century of industrial development. Duke Farms today serves approximately 150,000 visitors annually from across the region and nation. The property is completely free to the public, no admission fees whatsoever. Saturday reservations are required from April through October to manage visitor capacity, but the reservation system is free. The site is open Tuesday through Saturday year-round, 8:30 in the morning until 6 in the evening. 2,700 acres. The largest privately owned undeveloped land parcel in New Jersey. 18 miles of trails wind through carefully restored native habitats. 9 interconnected lakes still fill the landscape that Duke excavated over a century ago at enormous cost. The Farm Barn Orientation Center offers permanent exhibits about environmental stewardship and sustainable land management. The orchid range showcases thousands of rare and native orchids in a conservatory renovated to modern sustainable standards. The Great Meadow supports multiple threatened grassland bird species that had been locally extinct. The Hay Barn, which burned in 1915, stands as picturesque stone ruins displaying marble sculptures that Doris Duke placed there. The old foundation remains on its prominent hilltop overlooking the Great Lawn, the 80,000 square foot basement and foundation walls of a mansion that was never completed. Redbud trees still line the descending terraces every spring, just as they have since 1911. The property runs on 100% solar-generated electricity from extensive solar panel arrays. It's home to the only fast-charging solar-powered electric vehicle station in New Jersey. Community gardens occupy some of the former formal garden space. Educational programs teach conservation practices to thousands of school children annually. Research partnerships with universities explore peri-urban conservation strategies. The foundation markets it aggressively as a model of 21st century environmental stewardship, a place that inspires visitors to become informed stewards of the land. The fundamental question the property raises, the question it cannot answer, is whether environmental good done in the present can truly redeem extractive origins in the past. Tobacco killed millions of consumers over the decades that Duke's products were aggressively marketed and sold. Factories systematically exploited child laborers whose lungs filled with dust before they reached adulthood. The monopoly crushed both workers and competitors. Now the property is dedicated to healing ecosystems and educating the public about conservation. Is this redemption? Is this justice? Or is it merely whitewashing history with environmentalism? The Duke House in Manhattan followed an entirely different path to public service. In 1958, Nanaline and Doris Duke jointly donated the mansion to New York University with restrictions on its use. Robert Venturi, who would become one of America's most important and influential postmodern architects, completed his very first major project, renovating the building for academic use. The Institute of Fine Arts took over the space officially in 1959. The first floor rooms, with their perfect proportions, became elegant classrooms for graduate seminars. Offices for faculty filled the upper levels. Research library facilities were carefully added in spaces that had been servants' quarters. Most of the original architectural integrity was deliberately preserved. Venturi understood what he had been given. He adapted Julian Abele's design rather than destroying it. 1970. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the building's entire facade and all facade elements as an official city landmark, protecting it from future alteration or demolition. 1977. The house was formally added to the National Register of Historic Places, providing federal protection. Today, the building serves New York University's highly prestigious graduate art history programs. It houses a world-renowned conservation center. It supports cutting-edge research in art history and conservation science. It's not open to the general public for tours. It's an active academic building where students pass daily through spaces Julian Abele designed, likely completely unaware of the building's complete history or the architect's story. Both properties successfully transformed from private access to genuine public service. Duke Farms became an internationally recognized environmental showcase. The Duke House became a center for academic excellence in art history. Both institutions erase their darker origins in their public-facing missions. Neither property prominently mentions child labor in tobacco factories in their interpretive materials. Neither adequately acknowledges systematic worker exploitation. Neither highlights the racial injustice of Julian Abele's erasure. Abele's name appears only in recent scholarship and specialized architectural histories. It's not prominently featured on the landmark designation plaques. It's not included in standard New York University tour descriptions. The tobacco origins are mentioned, but consistently downplayed, sanitized, made safe for modern audiences, presented as merely an industry rather than an addiction epidemic that funded monuments to excess. The monuments themselves remain standing. The people who built them with their labor have been systematically forgotten. Girls under 14 years old who worked in Petersburg, Virginia tobacco factories. Their names are permanently gone from history. National Child Labor Committee photographs from the early 1900s preserved their haunting images. Young faces aged beyond their years. But the photographs are rarely displayed in public exhibitions. Worker testimony exists in federal court records and labor board proceedings. Quote 13. The quotes appear in legal documents. They don't appear on museum placards or interpretive signs. Construction workers who built the Duke House left no names in any surviving records. This was standard Gilded Age practice. Falls, injuries, and deaths went systematically unreported. Workers were likely Irish, Italian, German, and Polish immigrants who had recently arrived in New York. They worked 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days per week. No safety equipment for working at dangerous heights. They were replaced immediately when injured or killed. Duke paid the construction costs. Workers' names were never recorded. Their contributions were never acknowledged. Duke Farms construction crews numbered in the hundreds, over 32 years of continuous building. They excavated 9 lakes entirely by hand and horse. No modern earth-moving equipment existed, built 18 miles of roads to precise engineering standards, laid over 2 miles of stone walls from massive rocks quarried locally, planted 2 million trees by hand, constructed 45 separate buildings. No names were recorded anywhere. No memorial marks their collective labor. Many workers likely suffered serious injuries during lake excavation and stonework. Moving massive rocks without modern equipment was extraordinarily dangerous. Their deaths weren't counted in any official statistics. Estate staff at both properties lived almost completely invisible lives. The Duke House employed 14 full-time servants when the family moved in. Names were mostly unrecorded in surviving documents, listed only by position in household management records: maids, cooks, butlers, footmen, chauffeurs. They worked 12 to 16-hour days. They lived in cramped attic and basement quarters without private bathrooms. Duke Farms employed dozens of groundskeepers, gardeners, and conservatory staff continuously. Constant daily labor was required to maintain 2,700 acres of formal landscapes. Most lived off property in local housing. Low wages, no benefits, no retirement provisions. Their contributions made the beauty possible. Their suffering and exploitation made the luxury affordable. Power plant workers in Duke's electrical empire throughout the Carolinas worked in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Coal stokers shoveled fuel into massive furnaces for 12-hour shifts. Many died from heat exhaustion before reaching age 40. Others developed fatal chronic lung diseases from constant coal dust exposure. No safety equipment protected them from burns or mechanical injuries. No medical care was provided by the company. Bodies aged and broke rapidly. They were destroyed within a few years. They were replaced immediately when too sick or injured to continue working. No compensation for permanent disabilities. No records of casualties or deaths exist in company archives. The systematic erasure of workers was comprehensive and deliberate across all Duke enterprises. Official histories mention craftsmen and laborers vaguely without ever naming them specifically. Modern tours of both properties focus almost exclusively on the Duke family. Narrative. Architectural credits went entirely to Horace Trumbauer for over 50 years. Julian Abele has been mentioned only recently and often reluctantly. No memorials exist anywhere for workers who died during construction. No plaques acknowledge the exploitation that funded everything. Child laborers' photographs exist in archives, but are rarely displayed in public contexts. Worker testimony exists in legal records, but is rarely quoted in historical narratives. The beauty they created through their labor is celebrated constantly. Their suffering is systematically buried and forgotten. Walk through Duke Farms today, and you encounter everywhere physical fragments of incomplete stories waiting to be read. The old foundation sits prominently on its hilltop, commanding views across the Great Lawn. 80,000 square feet of basement infrastructure and massive retaining walls surrounding empty space. Descending terraces carefully landscaped over a century ago. Redbud trees still lining the stone stairs planted in 1911 when construction began with such optimism. The foundation was supposed to become Duke's greatest architectural achievement. Construction stopped permanently in 1918 when his priorities shifted. It never resumed. Materials were donated to World War I. Now it's the single most photographed spot on the entire property. Visitors love the romantic ruins. The incomplete monument serves as an unintentional but perfect metaphor. Gilded Age ambitions interrupted by progressive era reforms. Physical evidence that even unlimited wealth doesn't guarantee completion. A permanent reminder that not all visions are realized, regardless of available resources. The Duke House Indiana limestone has lasted 113 years with minimal deterioration. Julian Abele's proportions remain mathematically perfect. Every molding, every shadow, every spatial relationship reflects his careful design and classical training, but his name appears only in specialized recent scholarship. The building itself doesn't announce his contribution anywhere visible. New York University students pass daily through spaces he created, completely unknowing of his story or struggle. The architecture itself functions as his only real memorial, unacknowledged by those who use it daily. Landmark plaques mention Horace Trumbauer prominently. They mention Abele only in small print, if at all. The building remembers even when people have forgotten. The Orchid Range from 1903 still stands. Carefully renovated to modern LEED Gold standards, it remains the birthplace of most commercial orchid varieties available in America today. Lord and Burnham glass structure over 120 years old, still functioning. But Duke Gardens, which Doris created and loved and maintained for 35 years, was demolished despite public outcry. Physical erasure of one deeply personal legacy to serve another competing vision. Even buildings can be sacrificed to shifting values and changing priorities about what matters. The Great Meadow was maintained as perfectly manicured lawn for over 70 years. Doris kept it immaculate through constant labor. Now it's restored native grassland, supporting threatened grassland bird species. Physical transformation from artificial formal landscape to naturalized wild habitat. What looks completely natural today required years of intentional restoration work. The meadow remembers being something entirely different. The Eagle Gate bronze sculptures from Paris, cast around 1902 by French artisans, still guard the main entrance as they have for over a century. They've silently watched Duke's triumphant arrival as Tobacco King. Doris's isolated childhood. Gardens built and demolished. Land transformed repeatedly. Silent bronze witnesses to absolutely everything. They remain standing while everything changes around them, across generations. Buildings don't just stand passively. They embody collective decisions about who matters in historical narratives. What we choose to preserve reveals what we value as a society. What we deliberately demolish reveals what we're willing to forget. Limestone was quarried by someone whose name we'll never know. Bronze was cast by craftspeople who left no records. Stone walls were laid by immigrant workers who died young. Every single material in these monuments represents human labor that has been systematically erased. Official plaques tell carefully sanitized stories. Architecture tells complete complicated stories if we're willing to look carefully and ask hard questions. Duke Farms is open Tuesday through Saturday year-round. Admission is completely free to everyone. The 18 miles of trails are genuinely beautiful. The conservation work being done is serious and scientifically sound. The Orchid Range showcases legitimately rare species. The Great Meadow genuinely supports threatened bird populations. You can visit and leave genuinely moved by what's being accomplished there environmentally. The Duke House stands on Fifth Avenue at 78th Street, a designated landmark of Gilded Age architecture. You cannot enter without university affiliation, but you can stand on the sidewalk and admire Julian Abele's architectural genius from the street. Both properties serve purposes their original creator never imagined or intended. Both contribute measurably to genuine public good. Both are absolutely worth preserving for future generations. But preservation requires more than simply maintaining physical buildings. It requires maintaining complete memory. The child laborers who funded these estates through their exploitation deserve to be remembered by name when possible. The construction workers who built them deserve public acknowledgement. Julian Abele deserves prominent recognition for his genius. The tobacco addiction epidemic that killed millions of consumers while generating Duke's fortune cannot be abstracted into mere industry. The beauty is absolutely real. The suffering was absolutely real. Both truths are simultaneously and permanently true. Both matter equally in any honest accounting. The Duke monuments stand today as complex testaments to American wealth and American exploitation, to architectural genius and systematic racism, to philanthropic vision and brutal labor practices. They are magnificent expressions of Gilded Age ambition. They are monuments to monstrousness. They are utterly inseparable. History demands we hold both truths simultaneously without flinching. The challenge facing us is remembering what standard preservation practices usually erase, asking whether magnificence built on systematic suffering can ever be fully separated from its origins. The buildings outlast people by centuries. They outlast intentions. They contain stories we choose to tell prominently and stories we choose to bury deliberately. Everything is there in the architecture and landscapes. The question is what we choose to see when we look.